I remember when I was the pastor of an urban church in Los Angeles, and I was sitting in my car on a particular Sunday morning in the church parking lot, and I couldn't get out of the car. I was afraid. I needed to get out of the car so that I could get things started for the worship service that I was supposed to lead of the church that I was a pastor of, but I knew what was waiting for me. That there was all sorts of tension and turmoil in the congregation, and that there were people who really didn't like what I was doing with the church and were standing against me. And so I sat in the car, afraid. I knew that there was something wrong with this whole scenario, that there was something wrong, not just with this church, but with the Western church. And I know that many of you have experienced it as well. And so we're going to focus here on what happened to the Western church. How did the Western church end up in this situation? Because believe it or not, the Western church is not the first church to struggle with these dynamics and to be in the situation that we all find ourselves in, the situation where more and more people are choosing not to participate in institutional religion. And once we understand what's actually going on in the decline of the Western church, then we're going to be able to respond, not just in an appropriate way, but in a proactive way, which is what randylovejoy.com is all about. I remember one day when I was leading a Bible study in a thatched church in a village in Tet province in Mozambique. The church was filled with people who had spent the last 3 decades of their lives in a refugee camp in Malawi, the neighboring country, because of a civil war that had been just brutal and continuing on year after year after year in their own country. Finally, they were able to come back and to rebuild their lives, and they had to rebuild because everything was destroyed. But they were gathered together in this church, ready and eager to learn more about the Bible, to talk to each other about faith and how to walk on their faith journey. It was an exhilarating place to be. And then on top of that was about 20 minutes into our study and conversation together, another couple of men walked in and said that they had just walked 20 miles because they heard that there was a Bible study in this village, and would we mind if they joined us in our study? As I talked about that story with some other folks from the United States later, one of the things that we realized was that somehow in Mozambique at that time, the air was thick with spirituality, with a desire to learn more about the Bible, to learn more about Jesus, to apply it to their everyday lives. And it was such a contrast to the way that it felt in our home country of the United States. But if you go back far enough in history, you find that in the United States as well, there have been those moments where the air has been just as thick with that desire to move forward spiritually, with that excitement that something positive is going on, a very different experience to what we experience in many of our churches today. And so if we're going to understand how the Western church has gotten where it has gotten, we've got to start with where it began. We've got to start with where early Christianity began. And the main point here is that Christianity is not about a building. It's not about a structure. It's not about a particular way of doing things. At its heart, Christianity is about a belief that the early Christians had and that many, many Christians in different cultures, places, and times since then have also experienced, which is that something happened in the teaching and life and death and, yes, resurrection of Jesus that changed the world. And Christianity is the way in which we can engage that thing that's changed, that relationship with Jesus, and begin to experience in our lives the type of transformation that Jesus spoke of, to such an extent that people commonly talk about being in a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's the heart of Christianity. That's the lifeblood of Christianity. That's what Christianity is supposed to be all about. And that's where Christianity begins in a given group of people or place or culture. So back to the small urban church in Los Angeles. And I can remember a Sunday that I knew that we had somebody who was a very new visitor to our congregation. Now, there are a few things that showed that to me. The first was that she had actually walked up to the front row and sat in the front row. And as most people that have been around a church for a while, you know, you sit at least 3 rows back in the pews. Second of all, as we stood, I was sitting near her, and as we stood up to sing a hymn, she kind of fumbled around to find the hymn book, and you could tell that she was working really hard to follow what we were doing in the church. Now, I was really impressed with the fact that when they said, let's sing hymn number 367, that she didn't turn to the page in the hymnal, but instead she actually turned to hymn number 367. That was really well done because that's not clear. But then as we began to sing, she sang the first line and then went to the second line on that page with the hymn there. And that's where she ran into trouble. Because when you read or when you sing from a hymnal, you go with line 1, then you jump down to the next part, line 1, then you jump down to the next part, line 1, and then if you're finished with that verse, then you go back up again and start at line 2 and go to line 2 and go to line 2. So I quickly showed her that, she picked it up, and it was no problem. But what I realized was I watched her was how many details we have structured into a Western church's worship that are not obvious, that have been developed certainly to help people and support people in their worship. But if you don't know those details, then you're lost. None of this is a problem. It's actually something that naturally happens. When a group gathers together and the group becomes substantial enough that they're sharing that experience that they have of the change that has been brought by Jesus, then they begin to structure their worship services, structure the way that they meet together, structure the architecture of their building. All of that is natural. All of that is building and developing a kind of structure that eventually becomes an institution to support what's going on in that community and actually to make it easier, in best case scenario, easier for other people to come in, learn the ropes, and figure out how to be a part of that community. All of that is good. All of that is good, except for 2 things. One is that what tends to happen in a community that is well-defined is that the experience that originally developed the community starts to get lost, or at least can get lost, because it's about maintaining those specifics of the institution. That's what becomes the identity. For example, I'm a Presbyterian pastor. Well, when people ask you what's a Presbyterian, what you often move toward is the type of structure, the checks and balances that the Presbyterian governance system has. And that's all fine and good and helpful, but if that becomes the focus of your time and your energy and even a sense of your identity, then you're losing that initial experience, that original experience that brought it all about. I remember when I was a pastor in South Carolina before urban Los Angeles. I was an associate pastor in a larger congregation. And for them at that time, Wednesday nights were second only to Sunday in terms of your church involvement. I mean, we had a full-blown deal, full meal every time. We had childcare, we had classes and things for kids. We had all sorts of programs for adults, educational programs. I mean, it was a big deal. But I can remember when soccer in that town in South Carolina began to challenge the church. That is, kids soccer started to have practices and even games on Wednesday nights. And then people in that church would struggle. Well, do I support my kids' love for soccer and their activity and sports? Or do I say, no, you can't do that and bring them to church on Wednesday as well as Sundays? But when I got to Los Angeles, Wednesday nights were long gone. I mean, some churches would still do it, but there was tons of competition and everybody recognized that. The change that was happening when I was in Los Angeles was with Sunday morning. Because suddenly I had a bunch of people who were in different industries that worked on Sunday mornings. They wanted to be a part of the life of the church community, but they couldn't make it on Sunday mornings. And so what were we going to do? Not only that, but our main meeting times on Tuesday nights, for example, were not really doable for the vast majority of people. Because you see, the church that I inherited was a church that was set up for people who worked 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, who had one parent who would work, one parent staying at home. And so everything was set up for it to align well with that way of life. But as we all know now, especially post-pandemic, that way of life is long gone. But the institution continues to assume or be built upon that way of life. And so there's a strong misalignment between the institution and between people's everyday lives. And this is where the major problem comes in for the church. Because our knee-jerk response in any area of life is we kind of don't like change. It takes a lot of work to change things. And so with the church, you get a lot of folks that start off by just being angry with people that, aren't committed. I mean, you're not bringing your kids to the church on Wednesday. You're taking them to soccer instead. You're clearly not committed. Or you're not coming to worship on Sunday morning. Well, you're clearly not a committed Christian. But after a while, most people realize that's not helpful. But then there's this inability to just realize we're going to have to radically change. Instead, there's this sense that something's going to happen, whether it's better leadership or a change in the community, or something's going to happen so that it's all going to be like it used to be and it's all going to be fine. But that's not working either for our churches. What's really needed is a massive change, kind of a reboot in the institutional structures of our religious organizations. And as we're in this situation where the church has gotten so much out of alignment with our society, and where pastors and other leaders are trying to make changes, we end up hurting people that really loved a very particular way of being the church. And then on the other side of that, we end up hurting people who aren't conforming to that particular way of being the church. People who are perhaps more interested in exploring new possibilities and new ways. People that want to create new artistic opportunities for worship. And there's a clash in many of our churches that becomes very dysfunctional. And honestly, what's happening over time is the more explorer, creative types are tending to leave the congregations, and they're becoming more and more concentrated in many cases with people that just want everything to stay the same. That misalignment, the problem is the culture, not the church. And you see, the point is, the heart of Christianity is not the institution. It's not the thing that's causing the problem. What we all need to do is reboot and go back to that original experience that developed all of this institutional stuff in the West as kind of a reboot, and then from there to begin to experiment with what forms of church would actually work in the emerging rhythm of life that's going on around us today. So, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to talk a lot more about that in some future videos, but right now I just want to give you a different framework, the framework that we use at randylovejoy.com for the situation that we find ourselves in. And it goes back to a story in a New Testament book called The Acts of the Apostles. And that's actually the story of how Christianity moved from being a small subgroup among the Jewish people to being a faith that started spreading through the non-Jewish world as we know of it today. The key thing there is that the way that the church expanded beyond Jerusalem was through persecution. It wasn't the plan of somebody that kind of came up with a great master plan and said, hey, let's get out there and share this experience of Jesus with other people in ways that are going to cross cultures. That's not how it happened at all. As a matter of fact, the word that is used in Acts and even later in letters called 1st and 2nd Peter is the word scattering. It is that the people were scattered because of this persecution. And it's as they were scattered out of their own lands, out of the life that they knew, they went out and engaged new people in new villages and new places and began to share with them about what they had experienced through committing themselves to Jesus. And other people, these non-Jewish people, began to get excited about it as well because it fit with their own experience. It became a part of their own lives, and they began to experience this thing called a relationship with Jesus Christ. But what that means is the framework we need to use that I think is really helpful in our time is to think of the church as being scattered, that the church is being scattered out so that we can reboot, so that we can start fresh, so that we can start anew. And that's what randylovejoy.com is all about. We want to come alongside those of you that are explorers and creators and people that are really ready to go on a journey on the fringes of institutional religion, to begin to integrate your faith into your everyday life as it now stands. And we believe that as we do that together, then we will begin to seed the future church. That is, that we will begin to start the development of what generation from now at least will be the shape of the new Western church. It's not going to look like the old Western church because it's going to be something that draws out of the new life, the emerging rhythm of life that we still don't know what post-pandemic life is going to look like. And the church is going to be connected to that post-pandemic view of life. Now, if that is an adventure that you want to be a part of, then I encourage you to sign up for the weekly newsletter to begin to really look at all of the free information we have out there, whether it's on our social media channels or whether it's on the website, www.randylovejoy.com. And I'd encourage you to sign up for a 15-minute conversation that we could have together on Zoom to talk about who you are, where you are, answer questions. I'd love to get to know you because we are committed to your success in integrating your faith into your life, your relationships, and your community, so that together we can all make good happen.